Welcome, everyone. I'm thrilled to have you here for the 5th episode of our PLOS Webinar Open 2.0 series. And my name is Agata Morka. I am Regional Director Publishing Development Europe for PLOS, and I am your host for this series. This series is all about the next big thing in open science with a special focus on Europe. So we are trying to gather visionary minds and talk about what's next for open science. So what you can expect here is hopefully lively discussions, bold opinions, and every now and again, probably some disagreement, which is where the real progress happens. So here's what makes this webinar series unique. So first of all, no slides allowed. So this is strictly conversational. We're going to talk to each other. We're going to talk to the audience. No one needs slide decks at the end of their week. The other thing that is quite unique about this series is that we have chosen probably the worst time slot ever, so a Friday afternoon. And we did it deliberately so that we can send you off to your weekends, hopefully feeling inspired after our discussions here. We will have 45 minutes of discussion with our speakers, and then we'll open up the floor for your questions. So please put your questions in Q&A. So I think that we should just jump right in. So today's topic is the curious case of open science, case studies in monitoring open science. So what can real world examples teach us about tracking the progress of open science? While we often discuss changing open science policies and behavior in the abstract, actually the real world examples of open science monitoring provide a practical model for where to start and how to measure impact and unexpected effects. So by examining specific context from cross-sector partnerships to disciplinary shifts, we can gain, hopefully, a deeper understanding not only of where, when, and how open science is occurring, but also of how it is or it is not transforming research cultures. So today we will look into the case study approach as a powerful lens for understanding, refining, and advancing open science practices. And we will do so with 3 stellar speakers. I will start with Antonia. So Antonia Correa is an academic librarian working for national and European projects at Universidade do Minho in Portugal. Her main interests are all subjects related to open science. And I asked all our speakers to share one unexpected thing with us about themselves. And Antonia told me that despite her petite physique, she was a federated athlete and competed in rowing at national level in her youth. Very inspiring. Next, we have Sabina Lonelli, who is a philosopher of science and professor at the Technische Universität in Munich, Germany. She is very well known for her work on scientific practices, data-centric science, and open science policies. And surprisingly, other than open science, her other big passions are swimming and music. And last, we have Ismael Rafols, who is a senior researcher at Ingenio Polytechnic University of Valencia, and also the UNESCO Chair on Diversity and Inclusion in Global Science at CWTS Leiden. His current focus is on inequities in research priority setting, in particular for SDGs. And surprisingly, Ismael, during his PhD in Japan, was a member of a traditional Japanese dancing group. Thank you very much for sharing these unexpected facts with us. I hope that this will make for a more human discussion here. Before we dive into our topic of open science monitoring, I think that it would be nice to first discuss the actual subject of the monitoring itself. So open science. And Sabina, could you tell us a little bit more about your idea of open science, which is understood more as judicious connections rather than access?
Thank you very much, Agatha, and it's great to be here and in conversation with you and these wonderful colleagues. So just to give a sense, my framework, I'm a philosopher, as you said, my framework for thinking about openness in open science actually is very inspired by discussions that we've been having over decades around assessment and the use of metrics to think about research. And one of the things that we've kept observing, and as we'll delve deeper during this webinar, very much also on the basis of qualitative research, one of the things we've been observing is the fact that when you understand openness and open science as a matter of sharing outputs, in many ways, this actually runs counter many of the very practices that many of the people who are trying to support open science are trying to push. So if you're trying to focus on outputs, what you end up focusing on are things that are quantifiable, things that are parceled out, commodified, can be traded in particular ways. So of course, this makes them shareable in a more obvious sense, but very often it doesn't end up capturing, if you want, the spirit and the basic framing of the idea of openness, which is not so much to be able to get us to exchange stuff, if you want, but is to enable better communication and better engagement, both among people involved in making knowledge in science, but also beyond that, between science and society. And this, I think, has always been an awareness that's at the heart of the open science movement. But I think in the rush to try and institute guidelines and tools and infrastructures that may allow us to communicate better, the emphasis on sharing has really taken over many of these other considerations. So this is where I've introduced a different philosophical framework that, of course, links up to many of the things that people have been doing in open science, but maybe it needed to be a bit framed also in a sort of more conceptual sense, where the emphasis is not so much on the stuff we share, really, but it's on the social agency, which is really the glue for what open science is. Open science is about allowing us to have better dialogue and actually communicate better among people. And we may be able to use many tools, many infrastructures, machines and models to be able to do this. But ultimately, and we've seen it also, as we will discuss in many case studies, what seems to make open science particularly successful in terms of really supporting better science that is much more open with respect to society, that's more inclusive. All of this is really premised on people who are making efforts to support open science, making decisions about which publics, which audiences are we really trying to involve in open science efforts, and which ones we're going to have to leave behind, because we cannot really always talk to everybody at the same time. And is this human effort and also this decision-making effort all the time that actually generates, I think, the best forms of open science. So in that sense, the attempt has been to try and reframe the idea of open science, not so much as the idea of sharing things, but actually the idea of establishing connections among the humans involved in research and beyond, and establish judicious connections. So situations where people are not just talking to anybody. I mean, that's not a particularly, so for some people, it may be a big effort, but that's not really what we want in science. Rather, we want to have a judgment exercise at any moment of this networking and this engagement around what are the best types of dialogues and best types of discussions and connections for the work that we're trying to do, and also for the social goals as well as the scientific goals that we're trying to achieve. I hope that's clearer.
Absolutely. And Ismael, so I hope that we prepared the ground here for to dive deeper a little bit into open science monitoring. And you've written extensively about different ways of monitoring open science. What do you think? Do you think that current approaches are ambitious enough to drive real transformation? And what role do you think case studies can play in making that monitoring more actionable?
Well, thanks for the invitation. Pleasure being here with also with these wonderful colleagues. I think the introduction words by Sabina are important in the sense of telling us what is different about the notion of open science, which is about the connections, not just the outputs of science that have been traditionally shared. And when thinking about monitoring, if you let me go back a bit into history, in different moments in history, there have been different ways of monitoring that have responded to the way the science has been understood at a certain time. So after World War II, the main model that people had about how science works was that there were the universities making basic research, there were national research labs making applied research, then there were the companies making the technologies and the innovations, and there would be just a flow, a natural flow from one to the other. And in that case, the model that was dominant was this so-called linear model. The way of monitoring was just counting the inputs and the outputs, right? Now, in the 80s, 90s, there was the realization that this model did not explain innovation. And whereas in the first model, an example of the way of monitoring is the so-called Frascati manual of the OECD, which was published in 1963. So in the 90s, there was the realization that actually for innovation, no such linear flow could be observed. It was much more about interactions, but the focus was in interactions with companies. So the OECD developed another manual, the so-called Oslo manual, which focused on the interactions of the companies. And this was the dominant model of the 90s, early 2000s. That was very much about small spin-offs, the patents of researchers that were in universities and then in small companies that were bought by bigger companies. So there was an emphasis on monitoring the interactions. And for this, the OECD developed questionnaires that are still being sent, Community Innovation Surveys, called it in Europe. Now, in open science, we say for science to be a public good, we need to think of the interactions, not just with companies, but with a variety of stakeholders, with policymakers, with civil society organizations, with different parts of the government that are thinking about how science can become this public good. And this means that we need a really different framework. And then if we need a framework, if we think that open science is a different way of thinking of how science works and how it can benefit society, we cannot just keep using the statistics that we were using before, which were centered on publications and patents. We do not have the questionnaires that some national statistical offices are making for the companies. So we need to think about how we capture the interactions and why we do not have the larger scale statistical tools doing case studies and learning about how these interactions occur in case studies. We think that it's a very good way to get started.
Thank you, Ismael. Sabina, I think that you share this this strong advocacy for case studies and open science monitoring with Ismael. So I wanted to ask you, first of all, what drew you to this approach? And if you could share one example from your research, a project or a case study that really especially captured your imagination somehow or revealed something completely unexpected.
Absolutely, thank you. So I was lucky because I'm a philosopher interested in scientific practices to actually end up doing several studies, and now we're also carrying out a big project on the practices involved in open science, indeed, looking in detail at the conditions on the ground under which different types of researchers working in different domains, we're usually in my group looking at biology, environmental science, agricultural science, are actually conducting their work. and particularly asking questions around what does it mean for them in practice, in their everyday existence and work? What does it mean to share things? What does it mean to be open? What does it mean to communicate? And how is this impacting then the production of knowledge in these different environments? So I was lucky to spend several years doing very detailed collaborations with research groups around the world, particularly in Italy, in Greece, in the UK, in Germany, but also in Brazil, in India, in Nigeria, and in Ghana, looking at how, and in the States actually, looking at really what are the challenges that they encounter in an everyday work, and what are also the opportunities. And this, for me, was a great learning experience in terms of really thinking about what are the qualitative aspects of open science that we can capture through attention to case studies, and really are not captured at all by processes such as counting publications or counting citations, or even, in fact, by reading scientific literature, because very often these are aspects of scientific work that people don't tend to talk about in their scientific papers. There, they want to look objective, they want to just reconstruct the best of their reasoning, and they don't really give you a sense of what their everyday practice, the challenges, the issues that they've had to encounter really look like. So in that sense, for us doing this kind of qualitative work, so in the form of ethnographies, surveys, structured interviews, visits to a variety of laboratories, collaborations, has been really important to capture at least a couple of aspects of open science that I don't think would have been clear to us if we've only stayed with a more quantitative analysis. One is the idea that actually open science practice really is a process. And as a process, it requires training, expertise, and skills. It requires a lot of time and an effort from people involved. And very, very often, none of those efforts are really recognized by the credit systems and the incentive systems that people are operating within. So many of our collaborators in Italy, for instance, or even in Ghana, are assessed, especially if they're professional researchers working in academia, their work is assessed literally on the number and the impact factor of the publications that they emit. Nobody looks at their efforts in data stewardship, for instance, or how much time they put into trying to make the models they create into open source models. But we know these things take an incredible amount of time and a lot of skills and effort, especially because, of course, open science also is a situation, is a landscape where we have so many infrastructures, so many tools available to people. This is wonderful, but they're also difficult to use, especially for people who come from outside the institutions that created these tools in the first place. And so you see these things very clearly when you start to work with these groups and see that actually then you have situations where their goals and also their methods don't in fact align with the open science infrastructure that they're using. It's actually not that helpful from their perspective, and they're not quite sure how to intersect in the development of those infrastructures. How do they intervene in the governance of open science? To very many people, this is really not clear. Also, their social motivations and their accountabilities within their communities tend to be very often not taken into account within open science structures. It's nobody's fault in a sense. I mean, very often open science infrastructures are made by people who have the resources to make them. So the most powerful, the richest institutions in the world tend to actually produce them. But that creates these misalignments, these misunderstandings, if you want, where without wanting, these infrastructures exclude people who are working from different perspectives in very different locations and with different methodologies. And so doing these qualitative case studies becomes an absolutely crucial part of capturing these types of exclusions, but also capturing what is really required to get open science to work. And as I was saying, this is a matter of social agency. I mean, the amount of emotional and social efforts very often involved in getting people to engage with each other and collaborating are enormous. And, you know, very often these are not recognized as part of people's careers in science. You know, very often this affects especially vulnerable, discriminated against kind of parts of science, women, for instance, people who have careers who are dedicated to so-called research service. And this type of service is not acknowledged to be an integral part of science. So I think qualitative case studies really can help in that respect.
Thank you so much. That's a very strong case for case studies. And Ismael, you wanted to come back with a comment.
Yeah, I think that what Sabina just explained highlights the importance of the case studies in order to learn what is working, what is not working, which infrastructures are helpful, which infrastructures are excluding people. And this is a way of thinking of monitoring as a tool for learning, for improving. And this is different from another way of thinking of monitoring, which is thinking of monitoring for accountability. So in here we have a tension, I believe, because it is not surprising that many policymakers are interested in monitoring for the purpose of accountability. They're investing money and they want to see that something's happening for good, and they want to show, trends going up. But trends going up do not help you think what is not working so well and could work better. So I think I would like to highlight, and I think it follows very nicely from Sabina's comment, in learning who is excluded, what is working, what's not working, the difference of thinking of monitoring for the purpose of accountability versus monitoring for the purpose of learning and improving.
Can I just come back?
Yes, Sabina, go ahead, yes.
So just say, absolutely, I think is incredibly helpful. Thank you very much, Ismael, for this. At the same time, I think it's also worth noting for our audience and be interested in comments on this, the fact that what we learn about what is excluded from these systems has implications for accountability too, right? Because what happens at the moment, I think, is that we have a system of monitoring of open science where a lot of the open science efforts that actually matter the most are not being accounted for. And that is a big problem because it means that people have the impression, especially funders, have the impression that they're investing a lot of money in open science and maybe not getting as much return as they would want. But that's partly because the assessment tools, as very much also in your work that we have, don't tend to capture, as you've been arguing also, these aspects of effort, of stewardship, of research components, which are in fact absolutely capital to the research effort anyhow, whether it's open or not, right? So I think you're absolutely right that there is monitoring for learning and monitoring for accountability, but I think also there is a sense in which understanding better the system, so learning in that sense, also really help you to pick on what is our return on investment actually, and how do we make sure that we maximize our understanding of that, and so that we assess people correctly.
Thank you, Sabina. And I think that building on this distinction, monitoring for learning, Antonia, over to you. So you were part of a very important project called the PLOS project, which wrapped up this summer, and it was set out to gather real-world evidence on the effects of open science. Many fascinating outcomes. Since you were inside of the project, could you tell us about one case study from the project that really stood out to you and perhaps in a way changed your way of thinking about impact?
Yes, thank you, Agatha, for the invitation. And yes, so the PLOS project is an European funded project from Horizon Europe. So it ran from September 2022 up until August this year. And well, we produced some important things like frameworks, the open science impact pathways, cost benefits for the analysis of open science, also a very good handbook of open science indicators where people can find indicators and kind of receipts on how to implement them and the tools that they can use to do it. And this project was very funded on 6 case studies. So we had a case study on bioinformatics from Elixir, 2 cases that were more AI-led, the COVID-19 and the emerging topics, and also cases that were on data repositories, such as the Dutch one and the French one, and also on publications and the infrastructures. And the one that I know the best is the one that I participated in, which was from RCAP, which is the Portuguese infrastructure for publishing on open access. So the RCAP is an infrastructure, and it is funded by our main funder in Portugal, which is FCT, Foundation for Technology, and it is also led by the University of Minho. And within this use case, what we wanted was to check to see if the publications that were in this repository increased the visibility of the publications themselves and also the institutions, and if there was any evidence of the usage by companies, so knowledge-intensive industries and SMEs. And this was our geographical coverage. Our focus was here mainly on Portugal, with multidisciplinary domain coverage, and we did it for the years that our FCT policy, so the open access policy was which the first version was from 2014 and was now updated in 2025. So our time range was from 2015 up until 2024. And within the case, all of the case studies, but of course our own of CAP, we tried to see, to implement the things that had been the frameworks, so the open science impact pathways, and also the cost benefit analysis, and some of the indicators that we chose from the handbook. And it was really interesting for us. So for you to have an idea, so RCAP is a national aggregator of open access repositories. It has over 1 million documents that are indexed there. 28 hosted repositories, which means that we provide the infrastructure for the universities and other entities to use if they wish. If they don't wish to use the infrastructure, and if they want to develop themselves their own repository, they can also aggregate the content into RCAP. And we have 100 adhering institutions and 38 scientific journals that are hosted, and 386 aggregated resources in RCAP. So we also have some content from Brazilian repositories, but this was not contemplated within our study. And we focused only on the content for Portugal. And within Pathos, the objective of the project is really to collect evidence of the open science effects. And for this, we also the project also conducted an extensive literature review on academic, economic, and societal impacts, and the results were really interesting. So it's really difficult to measure impact on itself, so there's still little evidence. And we also have this strong focus on the causal effects. So not the correlations, not the guessing. We think that open access increases. No, we really wanted to prove if there was in fact an increase of the citations, an increase of the usage of the publications, and so on. And so within this, what we did was, first we looked at the impact pathways, so the inputs, the activities that RCAP is performing, and then the outputs and the outcomes to later on be able to evaluate the impact. And this was really something that was really enriching for us, for ourselves, to understand really what are we doing, what are the things that contribute to the way that RCAP works and the way that is delivering services to the community. And then we started to analyze the publications, our data set of publications, and trying to use the receipts, let's say it like this, from the handbook of indicators. And in this specific case, we analyzed the science industry collaboration and the citation impact, and also we analyzed the cost savings through the cost-benefit analysis that we performed in this case study. As for the results, they were really interesting. So we found really an increased citation and an increased collaboration, although it was not a huge amount, but there was indeed some increase in the collaborations and in the citations. And we really found a huge importance, evidence of cost savings through the cost-benefit analysis that we performed. And so that was also very important to show our funder that the financing that they are providing to this repository network is really fruitful and is delivering service to the community and bringing increased opportunities for participation. And making the link to and picking up on some of the comments from Ismael and Sabina. So it was really interesting, some of the interviews that we did within the cost-benefit analysis, because some people really said, well, if we didn't have this infrastructure and if there was no hosting services, probably we would not have a repository, and probably we would not be able to perform so well or deposit our publications open access. And also, it was very good to see that the open science policy that there is for Portugal from FCT is also working. Because our policy says that even when people published closed access or gold open access, they need to deposit a version of the publication in the repository. And so this infrastructure really allows people to comply with this mandate if they have financing from this entity. So it was really good for us in terms of the results that we found, but mainly for myself, in what the process allowed us to understand about the infrastructure itself and the way that it is impacting the people that are working here in Portugal in the publication community. So, and these are my main takeaways.
Thank you so much, Antonia. So we've been talking about case studies, which obviously are very much bounded to a certain reality around them, local context, and so on. But I wanted to ask all of you now, because obviously we see major global initiatives that have to do with open science monitoring, like Open Science Monitoring Initiative, and the principles that they launched. So in this broader context, what do you see as the biggest challenges ahead for open science monitoring? And where do case studies fit in? Do they fit in? Are they complementary, critical, or I don't know, maybe even disruptive to these larger frameworks? Who would like to start?
I can start then.
Go ahead.
I see the open science landscape as quite problematic at the moment from the point of view of inclusion. So as you mentioned, I am leading the UNESCO chair in CWTS. And from the point of view of inclusion of researchers, of poor resource settings, the way that open science is being rolled out from Europe is causing quite a bit of anxiety. Why is that? Because many people in poor resource settings, and this is not only outside of Europe, it's also in South Europe, in Eastern Europe, many people cannot afford to pay more than 1,000 euros in APCs, right? And this means lower visibility, more problems in citations. So this reminds us that the path to hell is filled with good intentions. and that policies do not always work the way we expect, which means that we cannot have monitoring systems where we only measure the expected outputs, but we need really to understand the broader context, as Antonia was explaining in the analysis of the benefits of their platform. And for these, I would say that the case studies can be very helpful in picking up the things that we were expecting to work one way that ended up working differently, excluding people or creating, like creating many data sets instead of a one well-curated, properly curated data set, and so on. And just to finish, this also means this shift. If we think that open science, as Sabina was telling me, is not about access, not only about sharing, but about meaningful connections, about judicious connections, this means that the monitoring should be on the outcomes of the open science initiatives, not the outputs, but the outcomes, which means how people who were expected to benefit actually benefited, not in the long term, but in changing in the short term. But this is really difficult to monitor outcomes, which is why case studies can be helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ismael. Sabina, you want to? Yes, go ahead.
Continue from what Ismael was saying. Of course, like we get along very well, obviously, so we think along similar lines. And I think very much following on what he's saying, one of the big challenges, of course, is what Agatha, you were saying. Gosh, these are all idiosyncratic one-off cases. They're all to do with very specific situations. How do you think about them together? How do you compare them? How could you possibly use them to think about monitoring? And I think really there are interesting ways to do this. One which is available already now, and it becomes a cultural and political question, whether this is something that people pay attention to, is indeed, as you were saying, the more disruptive power of case studies. There is an incredible wealth of empirical case studies of openness and open science in the field of science and technology studies, in many adjacent fields. And so it's just a matter of, knowing that these things exist, go and read them up. And for policymakers, for scientific institutions, but also for researchers themselves to think, okay, how does this case, considering those situations, provoke me into potentially rethinking some of the things that I am myself doing? So for instance, we use this kind of work to challenge things like in my group, to challenge things like pre-registration, not to say that this is never useful, but to be very careful with people who are advocating that pre-registration is the answer to scientific efficacy and reliability across the board, because actually for many studies, pre-registration means different things to different people. It's actually very difficult to achieve in cases where research is more exploratory. So it's not just about testing a claim, but actually finding out things that you're not even entirely sure how to formulate to begin with, the kind of proper discovery, if you want. So similar things can be said for the concept of reproducibility in all the different ways in which this is now being enacted. People have talked about computational reproducibility, which very much comes from computer science. The idea that, well, you can run the same program several times to see whether your computer modeling, the coding actually works. That may work really well for that sector, but it really doesn't work very well when you're doing experimental research in biology. So case studies really teach already now. There's a lot of material available and published already now how to think differently about those dimensions of open science, including, of course, things about open data. There's lots of work on that in critical data studies. With Ismael, we have been also discussing, and we're working also together with my group in Munich towards thinking about how do we also use case studies in a way that can inform at a higher level of abstraction. And so we are putting together a template where we are trying to extract salient aspects of case studies so that we can make them comparable across different situations. Of course, there's always going to be limits to that kind of idea, because really, ultimately, to make proper meaning out of those comparisons, you should know something about those research contexts that you're comparing, right? But arguably, similar things could be said about quantitative metrics. So too often we're taking the numbers to be, the thing that we want, and we just trust numbers, to put it with Ted Porter, the famous historian of science. But actually, behind numbers, there's also lots of qualitative aspects that ideally we should take into account. We want to meaningfully interpret the numbers. So I think hopefully we will be contributing to ways in which we can also elaborate more formal metrics out of comparing case studies. But I think already now there is a lot that people who are working in a more quantitative sense can learn from those activities.
Thank you, Sabina. Antonia, what do you think? What are the main challenges in this tricky business of open science monitoring?
I have some thoughts on this too. So I think for the monitoring, well, we should avoid making the same mistakes as we did when we are talking about open science monitoring, avoid the same mistakes that were done with the traditional monitoring, let's say, and the misuses that came from them. So and in this sense, I think the use cases are important for people to understand how that indicator was used in that specific context. So, and I think indicators can never be taken as a standalone thing. So they always need to be put into context and to be adapted by the people who are using them and by the institutions or whatever. And because things are very different. And if we think of publication, for example, it's very different to publish in the arts and humanities from publishing in, let's say, hard sciences like chemistry, for example, medicine. It's completely different. And this discipline differences should be accounted for the same way that other things should be accounted for. And so, and I think that one of the main challenges is really we need to rely on open and transparent information. On open science knowledge graphs, we already have some information that is free and available for everybody to use. But of course, it's not easy for everybody to use that information. So we also need some training and some guidance on how to use it. And this was one of the main challenges that I found, for example, so on how to use that information. Because of course, as we were measuring publications from repositories, we had lots of dissertations and theses and kind of publications that usually don't have so many citations, and usually you don't find as much in the traditional databases that people use. So, and of course we wanted to do this in an open environment, so use open open tools and open data. And this is one of the challenges for me. It's to use this information, the need for training that we need to use the information that is out there. And of course, these infrastructures and these databases and these graphs, all of them, of course, they are not for free, so they also need funding. And this is why I think it's important also to showcase. Of course, we cannot monetize everything, but it's important to make the case and to show that there is value in investing in these infrastructures. And so these are my main thoughts on this.
Thank you very much. I really very much appreciate that you see, all the challenges that come with open science monitoring, and that you see them in such a nuanced way. So that it has to do with different disciplines, it has to do with different contexts, and so on. So in the end, it's a very multi-layered, construct that we're talking about here. And yet, all three of you, I have a feeling, are strong advocates of case studies. And I was wondering if we have someone in our audience who thinks that case studies really don't work in open science monitoring? And if so, I would love for you to speak or to ask a question. I think it would be nice to have a little bit of, tension here. So the Q&A is now open. Please feel free to put your questions there, or if you feel brave enough, just raise your hand and I will unmute you and then you can go. I can actually see one hand raised and it's been a while now. So I don't know if this means that this person really wants to speak or not, but I will call you. So Moritz Maxeiner, if you want to talk, I will allow you to talk and you can go ahead. And if it was just by accident, then that's completely fine as well. I guess it was an accident because the hand went down. Okay, that's fine. That's completely fine. So I'm looking into our Q&A at the moment. Do we have something there that still needs responding? No, not really. Okay, that's wonderful. I will wait for our audience to warm up a little bit with their questions. And in the meantime, I am very curious. Playing the devil's advocate here a little bit. As you can probably tell, I am also in favor of case studies approach. So I am really curious to hear what are the most common popular arguments that you hear in your conversations about open science monitoring from people who are very much interested in more quantitative approach and who believe in numbers rather than stories. I would be very interested to hear your experience here and how you deal with these arguments.
Well, I can start. So
please.
I while giving training sometimes, well, it's the way that people are assessed really works for some of the disciplines. So because that's the truth, and it's difficult to change. And sometimes if the system works for certain disciplines, why change? And this is one of the arguments. So why do we need to change this? Of course, we know it's not perfect. It has its flaws, but why do we need to change research assessment if this is a way that it is structured and we already know how it works? So this is one of the questions that I get sometimes. And yeah.
Ismael, Sabina, do you recognize any of these? Does it resonate with you?
Well, in qualitative case studies, there's the suspicion that people write beautiful stories and hide things that went wrong or things that were not so successful. So this is why we believe that it's important to distinguish between the purpose of monitoring. So I just said that the purpose of monitoring for accountability, the purpose of monitoring for learning, and I didn't say the purpose of monitoring for evaluation, because usually monitoring but that's also came in the discussion. So if we want to hear about cases in which people are transparent about things that didn't work out so well, which is important for learning, then this has to be separated from the purpose of accountability or the purpose of evaluation, right? You're being evaluated, as it happens in the UK, for the impact. You're never going to explain the bad cases, because that would be against you. So the different purpose of the evaluation or monitoring needs to be very clear from the beginning in order not to have clashes.
Absolutely. Sabina, what did you have to deal with and how did you tackle the counter arguments?
I think, I mean, sharing also the experiences of Antonia and Ismael, I think I've had similar comments. But I think for me, the one that sticks most in my mind is interactions with policymakers and science funders who basically kept repeating to me, and still happens, that ultimately numbers are the only thing they're interested in. And they're not really going to be considering any other evidence that comes in other respects, because they think that this is really the only thing that's fully reliable. And, you know, coming from the history of science, I completely understand that impulse, but I also can contextualize it. And I know very well, personally, in my view, this does not correct. In fact, numbers can lie as much as qualitative observations. And the fact that you have a qualitative set of observations doesn't make them more subjective necessarily. In fact, sometimes it's quite the opposite. It's very easy to come up with a number which is an indicator. May I remind everybody that very often our indicators, though they are numbers, they're actually not directly relating to the data that they're summarizing. They're abstract. They're basically what we call an idealization. So they're numbers that are picked because we have a sense that they more or less capture the very complex data sets that sit under them. The GDP is a very good example of that, the gross national product. So yeah, I mean, are numbers more trustworthy? I don't think necessarily that's the case. They certainly give you the feeling to be more trustworthy. Of course, I think it's understandable that on the science policy side, there is a need for evidence that looks robust, because obviously, policymakers have huge pressures that are accountable to many different audiences, especially in these times, which are not very easy politically to agree on. And so I understand that impulse, but I wish we could normalize more the idea that actually having insights that come in forms that are not strictly quantitative actually are not just equally reliable, but a necessary complement to the numbers that we're analyzing in monitoring. But yeah, I think the obvious reaction for me that I get all the time is, well, if you don't transform this in numbers, I'm not going to believe you.
Absolutely. I like to distrust numbers as well. And our audience has finally warmed up just like 3 minutes before we have to close, but that's absolutely fantastic. So there is one question which has to do with these nuances when it comes to different disciplines. So the question is, can these examples of open science monitoring be applied to the humanities, social sciences, or is something different required? Would anyone want to tackle this one? Sabina?
Something as a humanities social science researcher on the qualitative side mostly, and I think that actually qualitative monitoring is particularly well suited to approaches in the humanities and social sciences and in the arts, because it captures parts of research that are in fact not being quantified at all. And very often, and now I go back to what Antonia was saying before, which I thought was just wonderful, this is not just a question of, oh, these are touchy-feely sciences, they're not really sciences, so like, you know, that's why we can't monitor them in this way. That's the story that you get very often. To be honest, is because the infrastructures we have at the moment very often don't capture outputs from the humanities and qualitative social sciences. So as Antonia was saying, I can give you the example of my own research. I publish quite a bit, but if I look at something like Google Scholars that captures a lot of different kinds of outputs, I get a pretty fair rendition of what I've been publishing. And these are, you know, published in peer-reviewed international journals. I'm not talking about preprints. If I look at something like Scopus or Web of Science, I get about 1/3 of my publications. Of course, my university uses those databases to assess my productivity as a researcher, but also many of the analyses of what is going on in research, what are the trends, what are the important topics being studied, are based on these much narrower databases. There's also a reason why we ended up in this situation. We're not going to have the time to cover this now, but the fact is that the way the infrastructure for quantitative monitoring of open science is set up systematically excludes, actually, not just disregards, but really excludes a lot of research that happens in the qualitative space. So it's a vicious cycle.
Yes, if you want to see the examples of what Sabina just explained, I think the REF in the UK is a good example. So the Research Excellence Framework in the UK uses case studies to showcase the contributions of departments, and this includes the social sciences. So if you go to the case studies of the REF, you would see that the pathways of the social contributions goes through ways which are very difficult to capture. If you appear in prime time in the BBC, that's something that it's unlikely to be in the databases, but it has a huge impact. And this is what historians, anthropologists are doing all the time when there is an international conflict, for example. Right?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We are almost out of time, unfortunately, but we have one question here from Louis Bachot. How can we approach causal mechanistic demonstrations of open science / practices on given outcomes, given that there is no possibility of studying this in controlled environments, as in comparing the same country with an OA repository and without?
Yes, so
yes.
Yes, causality was our main difficulty, I would say, because it's really difficult to prove. What we did was that we wanted to measure the impact of the repository network, right? So our CAP infrastructure. So what we did was we took a data set of publications of authors with Portuguese affiliation to some institution or company or whatever, with their affiliation to a Portuguese institution or company, and we separated into groups. So one group, publications that were in the repositories, and the other group, publications that were not in the repositories. And then we compared these two to try to find and this was our approach to try to do a causal approach to the study. So this is the way we did it, the way we found more likely and more robust to do it. Okay, so but it's really difficult to prove causality. Yes.
Thank you so much, Antonia. And there is also a project that Judith shared with us that was done at the University of Birmingham, I suppose, which is also an interesting case here. Sabina, you answered to Moritz, whose hand was risen by mistake. That's completely fine. Would you like to shortly address this question before we close for today?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I did it online because I wasn't sure.
That's fine. Actually, that's fantastic.
No, I mean, just very, very briefly, I would simply say the question was whether there can be a way to adapt qualitative studies so that it can be evaluated in a quantitative framework. And as we were saying, we are trying to develop at least a template which allows us to extract more comparative insights from across different case studies. But ultimately, I think the point we're all trying to make is that once you transform qualitative insights into something that can be quantified into metrics, you're really transforming the meaning of those insights in the first place. So the message here is qualitative research is important and is a very, very important complement to quantitative research. You need both to be able to get meaningful insights, because through qualitative research, you can actually get a sense of what processes, what practices underpin the story you get through numbers. And through those kinds of outputs, if you want. So I would basically try to push that message home that the moment we're trying to transform everything again into quantitative measures, we're almost defeating the purpose of trying to capture these more qualitative insights in the first place.
Thank you so much, Sabina. I think that this is the best closing sentence. Ismael, I'm going to cut you off. I'm sorry, but we are running out of time. I'm sorry. Thank you so much for all your insights. I really hope that this session made you think about case studies as a possible, very powerful lens of approaching open science monitoring, and made you realize that we're not only talking about, touchy-feely stories here, but about something that can bring a much deeper understanding of open science practices. Thank you again, and please keep in mind that the next episode is still coming, of the series is still coming this year, sometime in December. And this time, for the last session of this year, I would like to tackle the the idea of community in open science. So please stay tuned. We will talk more. Thank you to our magnificent speakers, and thank you to the audience. We very much appreciate your questions. Thank you very much and have a great weekend.